Okay, I'm going to get started. Even though not that many people have shown up, I don't know if there's a problem with the system. I didn't have any problem getting in, but we do have a lot of material to cover. This chapter talks about system security, and even though it just gives us a very high-level view of system security, there's still a lot of material that we need to discuss, or that I'd like to discuss. We'll see how much we can get through. The problem is I do have to leave in an hour today. I can't go overtime, so I'll just get through as much as I can, and then if you have any questions, please email me. Okay, security, as I said, is a very complex topic. It's a very broad topic. It's a very specialized topic. You can get an entire graduate degree in security alone. And so what your book goes through is really just a very high-level view of security, and while that's a good thing that it's high-level, I think it also causes some confusion sometimes because they're not able to really explain things in depth, and I really won't be able to explain all of it in depth either during this session. But again, if you do have questions, please feel free to email me. Before we get into the topic of system security, I'd like to go over your homework for last week. Last week, your first exercise asked you to describe how the Java protection model would be sacrificed if a Java program were allowed to directly alter the annotations of its stack frame. And I had a couple questions about this. I did post some things out on the discussion board, or I posted one thing out on the discussion board that might help you with this and help you how to think about what the annotations are. But basically, a stack frame is annotated to indicate that a program has certain privileges. If a program could change its annotation, it could give itself permission to access protected resources that it shouldn't be able to access. This would break the Java security model, and the protected resources would no longer be protected. In other words, if a Java program could alter its annotations on the stack frame, it could give itself whatever permissions it wanted, let it access whatever resources it wanted. So you really can't allow that in Java. Okay? Any questions on that? If you read it, it kind of seemed like a hard question, but it really wasn't that hard. It was like if something can give itself permission, you know, that's going to break the model. Any questions on that? Do you understand what the annotating the stack frame does in Java? Okay. Then let's go on to the next question. And this was, how can systems that implement the principle of least privilege still have protection failures that lead to security violations? Now, just a reminder, the principle of least privilege says that a program is given permission to access only those resources it needs to complete its tasks. Okay? So with the principle of least privilege, a program still has some access to resources. You try to limit the access, but it still has access. So what happens is if a hacker or a disgruntled programmer were to change what a program does with the resources that it does have permission to access, those resources could be damaged. Because the principle of least privilege can limit the damage, but it can't prevent damage to the resources for which access has been granted. So even though you're limiting what a program can do, if someone can go in and change the code in that program, let's say that your program was given access to a file, let's call that file X. Well, it may not have access to file Y, but it can in effect destroy file X because it does have access to that file. So we're again limiting what it can do. But we can't really do anything about that. Okay, if somebody still destroys data or destroys information or causes some kind of action that causes harm to the system, we can't do anything about that if that program was supposed to have access to those resources. Nada said, can we call it holes? Yes, definitely. Once the I don't know if that was a question on the Java question, or if it was a question on this, about this question, but either way, these kind of vulnerabilities that are in your system are called holes. So it's fine to use that kind of terminology. Does that answer your question, Nada? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, there is a hole here because we've kind of let that program have access. Okay, so if a hacker exploited a hole in the system where it actually could go in and change what a program does, then that could be considered a hole. So yes, it's fine to use that terminology. Any other questions on this? Okay, then let's move on to our topic for this week, which is security, and we're going to discuss different kinds of security threats and attacks, explain the fundamentals of encryption, authentication, and hashing, and again, we're just going to go over a very high level on these topics, examine the uses of cryptography in computing, and then describe different ways we can prevent, different countermeasures we can use to prevent security attacks. So your book uses the term intruder or cracker. I often use the term hacker for someone who attempts to breach security, somebody who attempts to break the security on a system. A threat is the potential for a breach of security or the potential for a security violation. And an attack is the actual attempt to break or breach security. Okay? So that's some of the different terminology that we'll be using. There are different types of security violations, and we'll be talking about these. One is a breach of confidentiality. And here what's happening is someone is accessing the data and they haven't been given the authority to access it. They're not destroying the data, they're just reading it. So this is unauthorized reading of data or theft of information. Now this happens if someone breaches security and gets credit card information, for example. Okay? They're not destroying the credit card information, they're simply getting that information and using it. Another type of security violation is a breach of integrity. Now this would be the unauthorized modification of data. In other words, let's say that I got into a bank system, I hacked into a bank system, and I changed my account balance. I gave myself more money than I actually had. That would be a breach of integrity. There's also a breach of availability. This is the unauthorized destruction of data. That would be some malicious intent where someone went in and actually destroyed files for whatever reason. Okay, deleted files, deleted information. Then there's also theft of service. This is an unauthorized use of resources. This could be something as simple as, you know, you're there at a public location and you notice on your system that you could access somebody's Wi-Fi network. Okay, they don't have their Wi-Fi network properly secured. Okay, you can violate security by getting into their Wi-Fi network and using it without permission. And I actually see this a lot, that people don't properly secure their Wi-Fi network. So I know I can use a couple of my neighbors' Wi-Fi networks because my system can detect it and they're not locked down. Denial of service is another type of security violation, and denial of service pretty much prevents legitimate use of a system. Okay, it does something with the system, so the system is so busy that no one else can get into that system. And this is often done on the web maliciously, although it can be done accidentally if you have a bug in a program, but it's often done maliciously when somebody wants revenge, let's say, on a certain company. And we've seen this done where someone goes and they make that company's web server so busy that no one else can get into that web server and get to their e-commerce site or whatever. And if any of you are taking any kind of e-commerce classes, you probably talk about this type of security, or security violation, I should say. Okay, are there any questions on that? The different types of security violations? Okay, then let's look at some ways that securities can be breached. One thing that's commonly done is that one participant, a user or a computer, pretends to be someone else by breaching authentication. In other words, you take on somebody else's identity. This can be easily done if you know someone's password, for example, or you can figure out someone's password. You know, some people still use, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as their password, or they use the word password as their password. And those kind of things aren't very hard to guess. So you can get into a system and act like you're that user by masquerading as that user. Another type of security breach is a replay attack. And in a replay attack, you repeat a valid data transmission, but you're not really authorized to do that. In other words, like, let's say that someone transferred money from one account to another, and they were authorized to do that. If somehow I got access to that transaction and I could figure out how it could be done, I could do another transaction exactly the same, except have it transfer money into my account instead. Okay? So that would be a replay kind of attack. Another type of attack Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, Amal was saying that there's no sound. Amal, can you hear me? Amal, can you hear me? Oh, it looks like Amal left. Maybe she logged out and is logging back in. Okay. We were talking about message modification. Okay, message modification is an attack where someone actually is monitoring network traffic, gets a message, takes it out of the network so it doesn't reach its destination, changes that message, and reinserts it back into the network. So again, if we use a bank account example, let's say that money was being transferred from account X to account Y. I could pull a message that says transfer from account X to account Y, change that message that says transfer it to account Z instead, and reinsert that back out on the web, so that the message was changed to do something different than what it was originally intended to do. Another type of attack is a man-in-the-middle attack. And what happens here is someone hijacks a session and intercepts communications between a sender and a receiver, and it masquerades as one or the other. So someone kind of inserts themselves in the middle of communication between two different parties. And so it's gathering information on both ends or disseminating false information to both sides. Okay, so that's a man-in-the-middle attack. And your book has some graphics of this, where we have some normal communications where the sender and the receiver talk to each other and the messages aren't impeded in any way. We have a masquerading attack where instead of the sender actually connecting to the receiver, an attacker connects to the receiver and masquerades as the sender. Or we have man in the middle, where the attacker masquerades as both the sender and the receiver to the two different parties, and so they're holding, both sides of the conversation with the two ends and deceiving both ends, both the original sender and the original receiver. So these kind of security attacks happen in a system. Okay, so we want to try to protect our system from different kinds of attacks. And we have 4 different levels of security. The first level is the physical level. The actual site where the systems are located must be secured against entry by intruders. And so here we would be securing our actual buildings. Sometimes you need, a card in order to get into a building. Computer rooms might be behind a door that you need a card to enter. PCs themselves might be secured. Sometimes you may actually, if you have a laptop, you may actually lock it, attach it to your desk so it can't be taken away, those types of things. All those are physical levels of security. The next level of security that we could worry about would be the human level of security. You want to ensure that only you or the appropriate users can have access to the system. Okay? And so usually that's done, with passwords and that type of thing. But you also have to guard against things like phishing and dumpster diving. And phishing is a type of social engineering where you get an email or a web page or something that makes you think you have to give them your password. Even on the SEU site, I've noticed that there are announcements out there or banners out there that will say, do not ever give your password. Even the support for the SEU systems, the technical support people will not ask for your password. Okay? So you have to really be on guard if anybody ever asks you for any kind of password or confidential information, because they try to trick you into giving that information. And then dumpster diving is really someone looking through your garbage, your notebook, anything you might have where you actually wrote down your password or your PIN. Okay? People actually will go through trash and try to find that kind of information. So that's what dumpster diving is. Oh, I should have pointed to that. The next level of protection or security is operating system security. And that's where the system must detect security breaches and also protect itself from security breaches. So in some cases, and we talked about some of this really early on, where a process might be in a loop, and depending on what's in that loop, it could be hogging the whole CPU so that no one else can get access to that CPU. That's actually a type of security breach. That would be a type of denial of service attack, even though it might be unintentional. It might just be, somebody didn't mean for their program to loop and suck up all the system resources, but it did. But so often systems have timers and so forth that will detect that and will cancel the process. But again, there are other things that aren't accidental. Someone actually intends to get into the system, and the operating system must defend against that. And then finally, a network level security would prevent communications from being intercepted and interrupted. And it's amazingly simple to read what's going on over the network. And people don't really realize this, but I used to work in communications at IBM, and we had things called sniffers, and you can actually get software sniffers, but we had actual hardware sniffers that all we had to do is plug it into the network, and it showed us every single message that was going back and forth between the network. Between computers on the network, I should say. And we did this not for malicious intent, but we were actually writing TCP/IP, the communications protocol that was being used, and we had to actually see what was going back and forth on the network to make sure our code was working correctly. But you can just Google software sniffer, and you'll find things where you can have your PC or your tablet or whatever actually be looking at the packets that are going through the network. Okay, so things that are important, you often want to make sure it's encrypted before it goes over the network, and we'll be talking about encryption later in this session. Any questions on some of the basic security concepts? Okay, then I want to move on to some of the threats that you're probably already familiar with. Some threats can come from programs. These are called program threats. And here we have things like a Trojan horse. A Trojan horse is a code segment that will actually insert itself into a system, and it gets executed. So what happens is, a program, written by a user can be used by other users. And so a program that contains a Trojan horse will actually kind of insert itself into the search path when the system's looking for executable files, and it will execute instead of the legitimate code, and it will take advantage of whatever protection domain that original code had. Another program threat is a trapdoor, and this is a security flaw that's actually created by a programmer to allow access later on. Okay, and so people have done this where when they're writing the code, they may work for, let's say, a bank, and they kind of give a secret entry into the code that only they know about, so that they can get in and modify, bank accounts or whatever. So a trapdoor is something where a person actually intends to steal something from a system. A logic bomb is another kind of intentional program threat where someone writes some code, puts it in a program that executes normally. There's no real security violations happening until a certain condition occurs. For instance, a programmer might put something in where behind the scenes their code is checking to see if that programmer is still an employee at the company. If the program detects that they're not an employee, then this logic bomb will go off and attack the system from within. Okay, another program threat has to do with stack and buffer overflow, and this happens a lot more commonly with low-level code where there aren't the protections to actually prevent overwriting buffers and overwriting right onto the stack. And with the stack and buffer overflow, it takes an advantage of a bug in a program and overflows the stack to overwrite the return address. Remember, when a routine executes, the return address is pushed onto the stack, the routine executes, and then that return address is popped off the stack, and that tells the CPU where to execute the next instruction. So if we can actually go in and change that return address, that would cause some other code, usually malicious code, to be executed. And that's a stack and buffer overflow threat. And then finally, one we're fairly familiar with because we need to run antivirus code on our system all the time, especially if we're running on a Windows platform. A virus is self-replicating code that's inserted into legitimate code, and it's actually designed to infect other systems. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Just so you have an idea, I want to talk a little bit in detail about the stack and buffer overflow, just so, because this is a nice graphic, you can see what happens. Here is the normal way that that code would execute, where something actually gets pushed on the stack, the return address gets pushed on the stack when a routine is being executed. And this return address is popped off the stack when it's done executing the routine. The way the stack and buffer overflow works is some modified code will go and start writing to these buffers, and it will write to the buffer until it overflows the buffer and actually keeps writing until it writes on top of this return address. And that is going to be the return address of some, malicious process. Okay, so this is something that a program can do mostly in programs like C, which if they're written in C, they don't have necessarily the protections that some of the other high-level languages have. C was really meant to be a fairly low-level language, and operating systems are written in C. So in C, you can do a lot of things to manipulate addresses and pointers that other languages don't let you do. But in C, you could do something like this and actually modify what's on the stack so that it's no longer a valid return address. It's the address of some other code that's going to execute. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting thing that people figured out how to do. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little more in depth are viruses, and viruses are very prevalent. And there are a lot of different kinds, and so I'm just going to go over some of the different types of viruses that you can get on a system. The first type is a file virus, and that infects the system by appending itself to a file and then changing the start of the program so that instead of the program executing its normal code, it goes to some virus before it executes its own code. So it does a little modification there where it kind of jumps in the middle so that when you start a program, it actually will run the virus and then run the program code. So you're often not even aware that the virus is running because it does eventually run the program code and you just don't even know it because the virus gets in there and runs so quickly. Okay? Another kind of virus is an even lower level virus. Rather than affecting a program, it's actually affecting the boot sector. Okay, so remember we talked about the boot sector on a disk and how that's where the operating system starts getting booted from? Well, a boot virus actually infects the boot sector on your hard drive, and every time the system is booted, it runs before the operating system even runs, and it replicates itself on other bootable media. Okay, so if you have, a flash drive plugged in that somebody could boot from, or you have a writable CD that somebody could boot from, or anything like that, it will actually infect that boot program as well. And so this is kind of interesting because sometimes these kind of viruses actually get injected as the system is being developed and can actually happen during the production of the operating system, or the in the factory when the operating system is being loaded onto a computer system. People have even been able to infect that code. Another type of virus is a macro virus. And a macro virus, I don't know if you've ever used macros in spreadsheets or in JavaScript or things like that, but a macro is a high-level language piece of code that gets run. And so a macro written in the higher level language can actually get infected. And then when that macro is run, the virus triggers. So you could have a macro, say, in your spreadsheet, and without even knowing it, you invoke that macro, and that macro has been infected. That virus then will run and infect your system. Okay? You can have a source code virus, and that actually looks for source code and modifies the source code itself to include the virus. Okay, so this is not where it's actually modifying the object code or the executable code, but it's modifying the source code, and this can be done by a compiler. Even a polymorphic virus, these are especially hard to detect because the polymorphic virus changes its signature each time it's installed. So the signature, what the virus looks like on my system, will be different from what the virus looks like on your system. Okay, so that's a real tricky one to try to detect and get rid of with antivirus software. Okay, an encrypted virus. These viruses are encrypted to avoid detection, but it will decrypt itself and run. So you can't see it when you're looking in the system because it's encrypted, but it will decrypt itself and run. Similarly, stealth viruses, they avoid detection by modifying parts of the system that could be used to detect it. For example, somebody might modify a read system call, and so that the you can't detect it, so that because when the file that's modified is read, it will use the regular read, but the original read was infected, and it can be spread. Okay, so it's actually, in this case, modifying system calls. Okay? So I mean, people can really get into deep levels of the system if the operating system isn't written correctly. Tunneling is another type of virus. It avoids detection by installing it itself in the interrupt handler chain or in a device driver. Again, you're actually infecting the operating system by injecting this virus code into things the operating system thinks is safe and normally uses. And then there's the multi-part type virus that infects different parts of the system. Okay, it can infect files, it can infect memory, it can infect boot sectors. You know, it does multiple kinds of infections that make it hard to detect and contain that virus. And then finally, an armored virus is one that actually is coded in such a way that it's hard for people who are trying to create antivirus software to decode and understand. Okay, so they do things like they compress it and they use different algorithms in it and they use different things so that it's very difficult for someone who actually finds it to understand what it's doing, so it can undo it or guard against it. Okay, and this is kind of a nice picture because it gives you a very visual representation of one example, and this is an example of what a boot sector virus might do by actually replacing the original boot block with itself. So that's a good picture that you can look at to show you how some of these things work. In addition to a program-level threat, the operating system concerns itself with system and network threats as well. And here we have a couple different kinds. We have worms, and a worm is a process that uses a spawn mechanism to duplicate itself and spread throughout a network, including the entire internet. Now, spawn is actually a system call on some systems that will allow a process to duplicate itself, kind of like we talked about the fork and exec and that kind of thing. But there is actually a system call called spawn. But this kind of mechanism has been exploited to use Unix networking features like finger and send mail and RSH, which is how you do a remote shell in Unix, and it'll exploit that to make it spread a worm. And so this will infect itself. It'll keep replicating across a network. Another network threat and a system threat is port scanning. And port scanning attempts to connect to a specific port on a system and take advantage of known bugs. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but certain ports are usually used for certain things on a system. So someone can attempt to connect to a range of ports on a number of systems and detect what service or what process is listening on that port. It can figure out what operating system is running and even what version of the operating system, and people know, okay, what are some of the holes in these different systems, and can go in through that port and exploit those holes in the operating system. This type of thing is often done on what's called zombie systems, and these are systems that have been infected, but the person who actually owns the system doesn't even know it's been infected, and then the infection actually moves from there, so that if it gets traced back, it only gets traced back to that infected system, and the owner may be accused of creating this virus when actually the owner did not. They actually were infected from someplace else. And then finally, a denial of service threat. These are network-based attacks that use so many resources that no other work can be done, or actually disrupt the network so no one can even connect to a system. Okay, so what they do is they pretty much overload the targeted computer and prevent it from doing any useful work. Okay, so let's say, we know that we have to connect to different ports, and let's say that we're connecting to a system, and we can deny service to other people by just putting our system in a tight loop that just tries to connect and tries to connect and tries to connect, and the system gets so busy trying to what's the word I want? The system gets so busy trying to service these different connections that legitimate people who are trying to connect cannot connect to the system. Okay, and so it's kind of hard to actually protect against denial of service, because anybody can do that. How do you know that a request for a connection is being done legitimately? Someone actually wants to connect to my web server, wants to connect to my retail site, let's say, or is it someone who's trying to deny service to other people by actually hitting this connection so many times that no one else can get in? Okay. So one way that we try to prevent or guard against some of these different attacks on a system is through cryptography. And cryptography basically constrains the potential senders or sources and the potential receivers or destination of different messages. So cryptography is based on having secret keys that are distributed to computers in a network and used to process messages. With cryptography, receivers can verify that a message was sent by a certain sender, by a computer that had a certain key, and senders can encode messages so that it can only be decoded by receivers with a certain key. So we're protecting these messages. And by messages, I mean they could be anything. They can be your login, they can be data, they can be anything that can be sent from one person to another or one system to another. So we have different encryption algorithms, and these are used to send messages securely across a network to protect database data, files, and disks from being read. So you can encrypt a file, you can encrypt your whole hard drive, or you could just encrypt messages that are going across the network. And a lot of times you want to work on a system where the passwords are encrypted so that they're actually stored on a disk in encrypted form, so that even if someone hacked into the system and got the password file, because the passwords were encrypted, they couldn't read them. So encryption is basically making something so that it's not readable anymore by a human unless they have the correct key, or even readable by a system unless it has the correct key. So encryption constrains the set of possible receivers of a message. So with encryption, you have a set of keys for messages, and you have a set of ciphertext. So ciphertext is actually the encrypted message. So an encrypting function E uses the key so that you can generate a ciphertext from a message. The decrypting function then uses a key so that it creates the message from the encrypted message or from the ciphertext. So the encryption takes a clear text message and encodes it, and then decryption takes the decoded message and converts it back to clear text. Okay, so that's basically what happens in an encryption algorithm. Okay, it's both the encryption and the decryption. With symmetric encryption, the same key is used to both encrypt a message and decrypt the ciphertext. Okay, and this gives you a nice example of how it can be used, where a message is written and then it gets encrypted. The sender and the receiver both know the key, and then the sender can decrypt the message, but the hacker, the attacker, the cracker, whatever you want to call them, can't understand the message because they don't have the key. Asymmetric encryption uses different keys for encryption and decryption. The encryption uses a public key, the decryption uses a private key, and your book goes through a whole sequence of what happens with RSA encryption, where it goes through this algorithmic calculation to do the encryption and decryption, where N is the product of two large randomly chosen prime numbers, P and Q, and then the key is chosen so that the key is another number that is not a factor of N, which or the key is not a factor with N, where N here is the product of P and Q, and then the decryption key is a different key, and the decryption key actually is a prime that has no factors in common with N, which was that P times Q. And your book goes through this in a lot of detail, but basically it's an encryption scheme where it uses a public key and a private key, and uses actually an algorithm to to generate the decryption key. It uses a logarithm actually to generate the decryption key. So the decryption key is a private key. It's not easily guessed. The encryption key can be a public key that can be passed around. Okay? So your book goes through a lot of detail on the asymmetric encryption. I don't really have the time to go through that, but if you do have questions on that, it does take a while to sit down and actually kind of go through it step by step and understand what's going on in each step. But basically the difference between symmetric and asymmetric is that symmetric, the receiver and the sender share the same key. With asymmetric, the receiver and the sender actually have different keys. Okay. With authentication, authentication is another thing that uses encryption. And this is different from user authentication where you're logging into a system. It's unfortunate a lot of these things use the same words in English, and I know that causes confusion, especially when English is not your primary language. But with authentication, this constrains the set of possible senders of a message. And again, it uses keys so that the receiver can verify that the message was sent by a certain sender. Okay, so there's some authentication that's done so that the set of senders is constrained so that only certain senders could have sent a certain message, or it gets authenticated so that we know that that certain sender sent the message. Okay, so it's another kind of level of security that uses encryption, that uses keys, and there's an authenticator. So the authenticator pretty much derives who the sender was and the sender key from the message itself. And your book gives two different examples of authentication algorithm. One is a message authentication code where it uses a checksum generated by from the message using a secret key, and it uses symmetric encryption. And then there's also digital signature, which is based on asymmetric keys and using a digital signature algorithm. Okay, so these things kind of, you know, what we talked about encryption also gets used in an authentication where you're doing different encryption and decryption, but just to authenticate the sender of the message. Okay, so it starts getting pretty complicated. You can see that an important thing in this is key distribution. With symmetric keys, the symmetric key should be used only by the sender and the receiver, or actually known by only the sender and the receiver. And this is usually done with what they call out-of-band distribution. Out-of-band distribution means it's simply not an electronic kind of distribution of the keys. You know, somebody writes the key down on a piece of paper and hands it to somebody else, or they tell them over the phone what the key is. And actually, I do this sometimes when people, when we're sharing passwords for something where, you know, more than one person needs the password, I never email the password to someone. I will call them and tell them the password, or write it down on a piece of paper, which I don't like to do because then they, you know, somebody can get a hold of that piece of paper. Oh, I'm sorry. But usually symmetric keys are kind of distributed that way, where they're not actually distributed electronically. They're distributed physically, you know, through on a piece of paper or by talking to someone. You know, symmetric key distribution is hard because a single user might need lots of different keys because they have to match the key of the sender. And if, you know, 100 people can send me encrypted messages, I need 100 different keys to match up to the different senders to decrypt these messages. Okay, asymmetric keys though, this is a little easier in that the public keys are known and the receiver only needs one private key. Okay, so that's a little bit different with the asymmetric. You know, the public keys are generally known, they don't need to be kept private, and the receiver only needs one private key in order to decode the message. And then finally, a digital certificate. You might have seen this where messages pop up on your computer because something was digitally signed and the certificate doesn't match. Okay, and you get this pop-up, do you want it still to continue, that type of thing. So with a digital certificate, a public key gets digitally signed by a trusted party to kind of authenticate that this really is who they say they are by their digital certificate. Okay. Cryptography can be implemented at different levels, and your book says that it can be done at different levels of the ISO reference model. If you've taken a communications course, you're probably familiar with this model, but just realize that at any of these layers, you can use cryptography. You don't always do it at the lowest level because sometimes you need it higher up. When the user's being authenticated or emails being delivered, you need to be able to encrypt and decrypt at that level. So just know that you can kind of insert encryption at any of these levels, and often it's inserted at multiple levels in order to keep things safe on the system. Okay, the other type of authentication is user authentication, and this is the authentication that you're probably already familiar with. This is where you have passwords. You want to encrypt the passwords to avoid exposure, but you still want to keep your password a secret. You want to have an encryption algorithm that's easy to compute, but it's difficult to invert. Sometimes you want to only store the encrypted password. Don't store the decrypted password because somebody can just get a hold of that file and get into your system. And then one thing that people do is, or one thing that programmers do is use salt in your encryption algorithm so that the same password, in other words, if you and I just happen to choose the same password randomly, they wouldn't get encrypted to be the same value. And so that helps keep things secure because the hacker wouldn't be able to tell that you and I had the same password. We wouldn't know, but the salt would get mixed into the algorithm so that the encrypted version would look different for my password than it would for yours. Okay, another way to keep passwords safe is to have one-time passwords, and here you use a function based on the seed to compute a password, and both the user and the computer use that function. And so there can be a hardware device. Often this is like a USB fob or key fob to generate the password, and the password would get changed very frequently every time that it was generated. It's kind of a one-time use, and the next time a different password is generated. One that's getting to be more commonly used now is biometrics, and this is where you have a password, but you also have some physical attribute. You have to put your finger on a scanner, or you have to put your hand on a scanner, or it scans your retina to make sure that you're really the person using your password or your PIN. And then you can have, two-factor or multi-factor authentication, where there are two or more things used. You might have a hardware device plus the biometrics plus a PIN, if you want to really ensure that things are secure. And you really want to ensure that the user is who he or she says they are. Okay, implementing security. Again, this is where you want to do multiple layers. Okay, we talked about those different levels, the physical security, the user security, the network security, and the program security, or the system security. You want to make sure that all these things are secure. And there are lots of different things that have to do with security on your system. You should have a security policy for your company, and that describes what's being secured. You should do vulnerability assessments to make sure that the system is secure. Make sure that it's following the security policy. A system can have intrusion detection. This is kind of hard because sometimes it'll detect things that are an intrusion when really it's someone legitimately accessing the system, so you have to be a little careful with that. But you know, it's the kind of thing. Intrusion detection could be something like where you're keying in a password, you keyed in your password wrong, it gives you another try, you keyed it in wrong again, it gives you another try, you key it in wrong again, and you're locked out of the system. Okay, I mean, I've done that to myself when I've just forgotten my password. So it looked like I was an intruder when really I wasn't. But you can have signature-based detection. You can have where it's based on known, you know, bad patterns. You could have anomaly detection where the system kind of knows what's normal on the system, and if something unusual occurs, it will flag that. And then, like I said, you can have false positives or false negatives even in the system where it thinks that there's a problem or it doesn't think there's a problem when there really is or isn't. Of course, we all use virus protection. A Windows system actually needs more virus protection than an Apple system, just because there are less vulnerabilities in the system. And then you want to do things like auditing and accounting and logging of all the network activities so that those could be reviewed by a human later. I know we're running out of time, and you know, here's what I'm going to do. Well, we just have this one slide on firewalls, and I think you're all kind of familiar with firewalls, where a network firewall can be placed in between a trusted and an untrusted computer. Okay, so you put a firewall between the internet, let's say, and your computer or your company computers, and the firewall limits the network access between them. Okay, so it can't access the computer. They're both trying to access this DMZ, the demilitarized zone. You have to be careful even with a firewall. A firewall can be tunneled and it can be spoofed. So you have to be, you know, set your firewall up as securely as possible, because firewalls can, you know, often use a host name or an IP address, and those can be spoofed on the network. Okay, you might have a personal firewall on your system, which would be, you know, kind of like if you use, I use Norton, and I use Norton's firewall on my system. I don't use Microsoft's firewall on my system, so that's my personal firewall. You can have an application proxy firewall that understands the application, or even a system call firewall that monitors all the important system calls and applies rules to those to try to protect the system. You do have 2 homework problems, and here's what I'm going to do, and I'll send this out in an email. I really don't feel like we were able to talk about authentication in enough detail for you to answer your second homework problem. This one you should be able to answer. This exercise 15-5 says an experimental addition to Unix allows a user to connect a watchdog program to a file. So the watchdog is invoked whenever a program requests access to the file. The watchdog either grants or denies access. Discuss 2 pros and 2 cons of using the watchdog for security. And so I've given you some hints here. Think about how every file access must go through the watchdog, and then try to come up with 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages to this approach. In other words, is a centralized approach easier to manage or to administer? Because the watchdog is kind of a centralized approach. Everybody has to go through this watchdog to get to the file. Will it provide adequate security? Is it more or less complex than the other approaches? Could it be breached? And how might having this centralized approach impact the performance of the system? So think about those things and see if you can come up with 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages of using watchdogs for security. Are there any questions on that? Okay, just think about if you have something securing a file and everyone has to go through this, what are the advantages and disadvantages to that approach from a security perspective? Okay, what are the advantages and disadvantages? And even from a performance or administration perspective, what are the advantages and disadvantages? And just give me 2 potential advantages and 2 potential disadvantages. Okay? Now this is a much harder question, and it's how can asymmetric encryption be used in authentication, where the receiver will only know that the sender could have generated the message, secrecy, where only the receiver can decrypt the message, and authentication and secrecy, where the receiver can decrypt the message and the receiver knows that only the sender could have sent it. Okay, so this kind of requires that you understand the keys that are used in asymmetric encryption and you understand what authentication is. In other words, who, the sender or receiver, needs to use which keys for each of the following. Okay, and remember that there's a public key for the sender, a public key for the receiver, a public key for the a private key for the sender, and a private key for the receiver. And so for authentication, who needs to be authenticated and what key does that party have? Okay, the sender or receiver. What key does only that party have? Secrecy means what key does the receiver have that the sender can access and use? And authentication and secrecy is how can you combine the 2? Does anybody have any idea how to answer this question? Do you have any guesses? Does this make any sense at all from what you've read? And what we've talked about? I really had to go through all this so fast that I'm really worried that you guys aren't going to be able to answer this question. So this is what I'm going to do. Just answer the first question. Don't answer this question. I'm going to get rid of this from our homework. Okay? Just answer the first question as well as you can. Just answer this question. I think your homework this week is worth 10 points. So I will automatically give you 5 points for your answer for question 2. I just don't feel like we were able to adequately go over these concepts for you to answer this second question, even though it's part of the course. So I'm going to automatically give you 5 points for this question, and I'll just have you answer the first question and give you the other 5 points on the first question. Okay, if you want to attempt this, and I will give you the answer to this question as well, but you'll get 5 points for this question no matter what. Just ignore question 2, Hala. That's correct. If you want to try to answer it, you can, but you can ignore it. I feel badly that to ask you a question. I mean, even though I know this is part of what was given as part of the course, I didn't choose this question. I feel badly asking you something like this when you really need to have a deeper understanding than I think what I've been able to give you in this short session. So let's just skip the second question and just do the first one, and I'll give you 5 points for this one. Okay? And I'll send that out in the email. I know final exams are coming up. You guys have a ton of things that you have to worry about, and trying to figure out this question I think would be very difficult. Any questions? I know I had to go through that kind of fast, and we're still over our time limit. I do have another quick quiz for you here with some simple questions that you should be able to answer. What is a worm? What is the goal of a denial of service attack? List the 4 levels of security. Describe 3 types of viruses. And how is a key used in cryptography? You know, I'm just giving you these questions. You don't have to send me the answers. I'll send out the quiz with the slides today. I'll send you the answers tomorrow. And it's just a way of kind of testing, did you get some of the key topics that we talked about? Okay, so I do have a quick quiz here at the end of these, but you don't need to email this to me. It's just for your own benefit. Okay, so that's really all I have. Today, I know some of you already had to leave. Some people already had to leave for their other classes or whatever. I will send you again the slides from today with this quiz, and then tomorrow I will send you the answers to the quiz. Okay? I know I hit you with a lot of information, and there's a lot of information in this chapter, and it's important because security is such an important topic, but we really can only kind of, you know, skim over a lot of this material due to the time constraints that we have. Okay? So if there are no questions, have a good week. And if you do come up with questions and you want additional explanation, I will answer any emails or answer any questions that you post out on the discussion board as well. Okay? So have a good week, and I will talk to you next week.